I'd like to call the special meeting back to order. And I understand that we have Matt from the governor's office. Matt, are you online? Are you there now?
I am here, yes, with right. Governor Dunleavy.
Okay, so we would be pleased to offer the floor of this meeting to the governor. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Regent. So I'm just going to take a moment. I want to once again thank you for allowing us to speak today. I know that we have Mike Barnhill from OMB that is there as well. That we'll probably go over some concepts and some ideas just for you as the regents to ponder. What I'd like to say is that the university is an integral part, obviously, of the fabric of the state. As I've mentioned on several occasions, I'm a graduate of the University of Alaska. I've taken courses at every campus. I've been in the state since 1983. I have two daughters that take courses and are in degree programs with the university. And I work very closely with the university as a contractor with the Department of Education out of Juneau, as well as actually worked for the University of Alaska statewide. So I have nothing but the greatest admiration for the university and where it can go. We certainly have a budget problem. We have a fiscal problem. This is no secret to anyone. And the university has been the beneficiary of funding over the years. In some cases, increased funding at pretty good levels. We're living right now. Some of us are still living in a belief that we have $85 to $95 barrel oil, which we don't. And this is no secret to most Alaskans. When we look at reports such as the Fisher report, the McTaggart report, the legislature itself over the past several years has been having discussions about how the university can prepare for the day that funding levels would be less than optimal. And those days are here. And so we reduced the budget in the February 15th or 13th budget that we rolled out. And this has caused quite a conversation in the state of Alaska. There's no doubt, and I'm not understating that. It's a conversation that needs to happen. And over the last couple of weeks, we've been in conversation with university officials themselves as to how we can partner to come up with a step-down approach to get the university to where it needs to be funding-wise, but also help the university in this process with time and funding so that the university can adjust to this new funding reality with regard to the state. The game in Juneau for many decades as a result of oil money and has been seeing how much funding we can get for our services and our programs, and that's understandable. I mean, the university needs funding to be able to provide the programs that Alaskans need. One of the other areas that we really haven't focused on and oftentimes don't talk much about are the outcomes. And this is a real opportunity, I think, for the university to have a real look in the mirror, which we all should, all of our systems should, everything we do in government should, as to whether we could do better by faculty, better by researchers, better by the students taking courses at the university for their education. And I don't think there's going to be any disagreement that some of our outcomes could be a lot better. There's no doubt about it. I've talked with folks. I've talked to folks at every level in the university, and everyone agrees to this. And so I'm gonna end it by simply saying that my office has been and will be fully prepared to work with the university on an approach that can get the university focused in a direction that lowers its overhead and increases its outcomes, especially for its students and its faculty engaged in research and in teaching. We're willing to continue these conversations. Bills were passed yesterday that put the issue of the budget back in my hands. And I'm hoping that over the next few days, as a result of discussions that have occurred over the last 2 weeks, that we can come to an understanding on how we can help, again, the university get to the point where it needs to be in order to be one of the best universities in this country. Certainly one of the best universities dealing with Arctic issues and issues of the northern latitudes. I think it's in areas such as science and engineering and some of our other issues we wrestle with internally in the state of Alaska. I think the university can be on the cutting edge of being a partner in solving some of these issues and educating Alaskans. And so, with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity. Again, we stand ready to work with the university so that we come up with a partnership and a plan to get us from point A to point B, and point B being where the outcomes that we all expect any system to deliver where we're focused on those outcomes and also the resources to get us to that eventual outcome. So with that, I want to thank you and I wish you luck. And once again, we do have Mike Barnhill from our Office of Management and Budget. They're available to talk about some possibilities, but I'm hoping that the Regents and the administration accept this offer and we get working together sooner than later, so Alaskans know that we have a university system that we can all be proud of. So thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Governor Dunleavy. Appreciate your comments. So, Mike, do you want to go over the
Sure.
some of your numbers?
Mr. Chair, my name is Mike Barnhill. I work for the Office of Management and Budget as Policy Director. I've worked for the state for just over 21 years. Just before I get into the meat of what I think will be a brief presentation, I just want to say a few things. First, I've listened to the discussion, or most of the discussion this morning, and I really want to express appreciation to each of the regents. I think this discussion has been excellent. There's certainly been a lot of good and hard thinking. I also want to acknowledge the difficulty of the situation. It is an enviable position that each of you are in as we try to struggle through this. And finally, I want to express, and I mean this sincerely, a respect for your role in the governance of the University of Alaska, and I'll elaborate on that a bit. My purpose here today is primarily to continue a discussion that the governor referenced a moment ago that began 2 weeks ago. In my job at OMB, I've been responsible for the university piece of the budget and are communicating that to the legislature. But 2 weeks ago, my job adjusted somewhat, and I was tasked with reaching out to staff and opening a new discussion over developing an alternative path. It's no secret that we are high-centered in the state over budgetary issues, and the governor expressed a desire to put compromise with respect to the university's budget on the table. I came up to Anchorage 2 weeks ago and met with Myron Dosh and Michelle Rizek and Alicia Kruckenberg, and we started that discussion. My recommendation is that we use this as an opportunity to focus at a more detailed level on cost drivers. Now, in my work as OMB Policy Director, I use cost driver metrics, cost metrics, per unit cost metrics across the board in every context. I did that in preparation of the university's budget for this year, but I thought it would be helpful to do a deeper dive, so I requested information. Information was provided, and I did just a simple cost metric analysis of the information that your staff provided me 2 weeks ago. The document that they provided is a schematic, if you will, of the University of Alaska FY20 budget, and it lists several dozen components organized by MAU and statewide, and it lists all of the funding sources and the expenses for each of those components. One of my theses has been that there are administrative cost drivers. Doesn't sound like that's a secret at all. It sounded like that was discussed frequently over this meeting and past meetings. But the first document that I have for your review today is a summary of the FY20 UA budget document that was provided to me of the overhead cost by component. And it shows the allocation of unrestricted general fund and the total expenses projected for FY20 by each component. That's the first 3 pages of this document, and then I attempted to summarize that on the last page. And what we see is that the university, without a budget cut, would propose to spend $169 million of the UGF allocation on administrative overhead costs. Now, I will hasten to add that President Johnson put some numbers in front of you in his presentation that splits out student services from admin overhead. I did not do that. I combined student services into admin overhead, and I want to make sure that the regents are aware of that. And that a total of $374 million is expected to be spent on administrative overhead costs, which is about 45% of the budget. And those numbers, that percentage, I think, dovetails very closely to President Johnson's numbers this morning.
Excuse me, Senator.
Excuse me, Chair. To those folks that are listening online, that's the second attachment within the board docs presentation, if people would like to reference that as things are being discussed.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Mike.
Now, you'll also see that we've had some discussion about how appropriate is it to include research costs or not include research costs when you're doing comparisons like this. So in the first table, I split those out so you could see the administrative costs associated with research and the administrative costs associated with the Fairbanks campus, not including research. The other thing that I did with respect to these numbers is I took out all of the community campuses. In the document that was provided to me, the community campuses that have traditionally been associated with UAF, UAA, and UAS are bundled together in that document. I moved all of the community campuses into the community campus line. So that is a summary of the structure of this document. Again, as I mentioned, the goal here is to try and come up with a cost metric or per unit cost metric. And the cost metrics that I use are based on full-time equivalent students, and the data that I get for that is from the university. My understanding is that the university uses a total of 17,555 full-time equivalent students. Full-time equivalent students are calculated based on number of credit hours. I further understand that that number may have come down during FY19. I don't know what the current number is. When you take the admin costs as reported in or projected in this budget that was provided to me and divide by the full-time equivalent student, you can break down the numbers by location. And so that's what I've done in the final table. And I will just say what the numbers are. We could have probably hours of conversation as to whether I've fairly accommodated various caveats with respect to different locations, but just based on the numerics of the document that was given to me, the total admin overhead expense per student is not UGF, this is total. For Fairbanks plus Fairbanks organized research is over $50,000 per student. For University of Alaska Anchorage, it's just over $20,000 per student. And for University of Alaska Southeast community campuses, it's less than $10,000 per student. Now, in other states, it's absolutely true that community campuses have a lower cost structure, and that appears to be absolutely true here too. What is significant to me is in my quest to find where are the cost drivers within the University of Alaska budget, it appears to show that the cost drivers are in the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Now, there could be a variety of reasons, completely legitimate reasons for why that is, and I don't know that we need to get into that today. But what it says to me in terms of this discussion that we've embarked upon is that if we want to look at reducing costs in a principled way, one path to take is to focus on the administrative costs that are driving costs higher than you would expect. Now, again, I want to just, caveat it by saying I understand there are reasons why Fairbanks should be higher. Utility costs, cost of living, research university. But it opens the opportunity to have a discussion at a more granular level about what can we do to save money in this particular bucket. So based on that information that was provided to me, I prepared what I called a discussion concept document to share back with staff to have the next round of discussions. In conjunction with that, I was authorized to put approximately $40 million add back for FY20 on the table as part of that discussion. Myron and I had a discussion. We agreed that we would continue the discussion. And I see today as an extension of that. I can go through each of the component items on the discussion document. That's the second document that I provided. But I want to emphasize that this was intended to be part of a discussion. It absolutely was not intended to be a dictate or a take it or leave it offer. It was extended. It was extended to the staff so that we could have a discussion and continue that. Now, there were, at the time I prepared it, the information regarding the pro rata approach was coming to my attention. And there were elements of that pro rata approach that were of concern. And I've heard similar concerns expressed by the chancellors today about that particular approach. First of all, it didn't appear, and you wouldn't expect this from a pro rata approach, but it didn't appear that it was focused on getting at root cost drivers in the university budget. So that was of concern to me. And because it's pro rata, the impact of that would be to reduce spending on and funding for academic programs disproportionately to the cost drivers that you can see in the FY20 budget. I wanted to get that on the table for our discussion. Because it's pro rata, the impact of that would be to reduce spending on and funding for academic programs disproportionately to the cost drivers that you can see in the FY20 budget. I wanted to get that on the table for our discussion.
If it wasn't clear to everyone before your statement, it should be now that that what you proposed here is not a dictate, but perhaps a starting point.
That's correct.
Regent Perdue.
And I'm really happy to hear that too, Mike. I know you have had a lot of experience in complicated state issues, and I appreciate your willingness to sit down further with us in some fashion and work on these numbers. I wanted to address the research issue because you raised it, and I was really happy to hear what the governor said on the phone here today about his understanding of the value of Arctic research and Arctic issues, engineering, et cetera. And you've said in your documents that you believe that we have a great research organization. I think that's what you said. I don't want to but you've said that it's a good effort. There's two pieces of money that are in your list. One is 20 million organized research UAF, and the other is 15 million UA research statewide. And I don't know if we understand what the 15 million is, and then I'll have a follow-up.
So the number equates to 35 million. There is a document that the University of Alaska produces in conjunction with budget documents that rolls all of its expenses up to 3 core services. The first core service is instruction, the second is research, and the third is public service. In the document for FY19, it listed UGF, unrestricted general fund, for research at 37 million. And in the documents for Fairbanks organized research, the unrestricted general fund is just north of 20 million. So I gathered, based on that differential, that, and this may have been a mistake I made, and you can tell me if it's incorrect, but the implication is that research in the rest of the university outside of the Fairbanks Organized Research Unit is $15 to $17 million.
And I think maybe that could be a follow-up with Michelle, because I think she's not clear that that's the case. That, and I appreciate your openness in looking at that issue. I don't have the numbers myself, but I know that she's not sure that it's what it is. So that's important.
Oh, that's part of having ongoing discussions,
right,
is
right.
to say, hey, you know, this number is
Right.
weird. Let's talk about where that number came from.
Yeah. I will say that I had a chance to talk to some of the researchers, and just to give a little bit of what they said, they do not believe that with the cut of the 20 million or whatever it is, that they'll be able to hold on to the 100 million. They're integrated together, and that the state it would be every shred of money that we're getting to support our research endeavor. The need for money to develop proposals that are not federally allowed on the federal structure, the match for labs or whatever the issues are, it is critical. And the work that we're talking about, Geophysical Institute of Arctic Biology, the engineering, Northern Engineering Research Labs, things have been in place since 1953, 1963. So I would like to invite you to come to Fairbanks and sit down with those researchers, and I know you're busy, but if you could, to really understand what their concerns are.
Sure. Mr. Chair, I would be happy to continue and broaden the discussion to any stakeholder that would like to have input on these important issues. With respect to funding for research, a couple thoughts for your consideration. I believe there is an understanding that state dollars are necessary to provide the match for federal dollars. And it's not clear to me that that is a correct understanding. Mr. Dosh and I had a discussion about that when I was in Anchorage 2 weeks ago. The federal government provides research dollars across the entire spectrum of higher education institutions, including private institutions. And there are many private institutions that are huge recipients of federal funds. They have no state dollars that they match. They use different kinds of dollars to match. And I get the point that these institutions have gigantic endowments. I'm not suggesting that we need to have a gigantic endowment in order to get match money from corporate, private alumni in order to match the federal funds. But it is an opportunity to explore that I don't think has been explored because of this understanding that I don't think is correct, that state dollars and only state dollars are required to match. Secondly, with respect to the leverage that we get when we match, President Johnson has repeatedly stated, and it's in his slides, that you're getting a 6-to-1 return on the federal to state dollars, and I agree. I think that's terrific. If only we got that in Medicaid. some of the research I've done of other universities, their match rate is higher. Now, can we emulate that overnight? No, we can't. But it does tell me that it's possible to move from 6 to 1 to higher. Michigan State, for instance, based on their annual report from last year, they're matching it at 27 to 1 rate. I'm not saying that to diminish the efforts of the University of Alaska. I'm just saying there are possibilities here that we can explore in order to keep the research unit as intact as possible so that it can deliver the high-value services that it does.
I just have one quick follow-up, and that is just pivoting. Because the Fairbanks is a portion of what you were presenting, I feel a need to discuss the issue of debt. And you mentioned utilities. Utilities are twice as expensive at UAF as they are in other parts of the system, 20 million in utilities at UAF. Which if we could eliminate that would be a great savings. The debt issue is huge. So there's a $22 million annual or debt service that UAF is paying, and UAA is paying 5, and UAS is paying 0.7, or the system is for those individuals. And the power plant is 10 million of that. Is there a possibility that a line of inquiry that can open with the state is to address the debt? Because the debt is something that, we've had to invest for an asset. So I'm suggesting that perhaps that's an inquiry that we could discuss in terms of all things on the table. It's a cost driver.
It's a cost driver, and I am aware, Mr. Dosh and the staff made me aware of the debt levels at the respective universities, and I see that it is a cost driver, and it is one of the caveats that I mentioned when comparing on the last page of this administrative cost document when you're comparing Fairbanks to Anchorage. At the end of the day, the costs at UAF appear to be more than double UAA. And so it's more than just debt. It's more than just utilities. There are other drivers in there, and I'm not here to tell you what they are or how to deal with them. I'm here to say we'd like to have a discussion about them. As far as your invitation with respect to opening the inquiry to the state helping with the debt, again, in the spirit of discussion and compromise, it's fine to bring ideas to the table and let's talk about them.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Johnson, did you want to make any comments?
Did you have me?
I'm sorry.
In the queue.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm so easy.
I did have you in the queue, and I.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mike, I don't know if I've met you, but I'm Mary Kay Hughes, and I've been on the Regent since 2002. So I've been here quite a while, and I went to school at the University of Alaska. So I'm pleased that you were able to join us today. I have a question with respect to, first of all, I have a comment. It would be perhaps ill-advised, but very important. We need to make sure you understand with respect to your notes, the notes with respect to replacing fees and that sort of thing, that is not something that the regents, as we go through our exercises, expect to happen anytime soon. As you can well imagine, any type of organizational change will cause many, many, many retirements or terminations. And so in that kind of state atmosphere, those things aren't necessarily going to happen. They may happen eventually, but they aren't going to happen right now. So that's one thing that I noticed when I first received this. My question is, you were listening this morning to the Regent's discussion, and we feel as a body that lots of things need to happen, and we think we know how we can do that. And if, hypothetically, the regents develop a plan, and of course, as you know, we're hoping to have this all before us in September. If we develop a plan that, in effect, address those cost drivers that you, not particularly, it's not necessarily the same ones, but address the cost drivers in a way that, in effect, does the similar things, is it possible? And I'm not negotiating because it's inappropriate, because we do what we do. But would the governor assist in the whatever was 38 million to help us in 2020? In effect, we're getting to the same place, but perhaps not, certainly not in the same way.
Through the chair, Regent Hughes, absolutely. I mean, if we get to the number and we address the concerns in a fair and principled way, that seems completely reasonable.
You would agree that there would be several ways, perhaps dozens of ways to get to where we need to get.
There are an infinite number of ways to get to the way we need to go. My primary concern that drove the way this document was drafted was the pro rata approach, is, in my opinion. Again, I'm not going to say it was intentionally, but what it does is it preserves high administrative costs at the by cutting academic costs, and I would recommend that as a way to start.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mike, for being here. I appreciate very much your being here and the willingness and interest of the governor's office in working with us on whether you term it step down, glide path, a multi-year compact. We actually raised that conceptually to the governor and to his staff on January 8th of 2019. And while we, I think, have had good, very good and much appreciated cooperation from the administration, particularly on our pursuit for our land grant deficit, it's been pretty quiet on these issues until the last couple of weeks. Again, with appreciation that we've begun those conversations. You know, alongside, you know, through the legislative process, Mike and I had many opportunities to present to House and Senate Finance committees, and I think it was, I think anyway, it was a very respectful process, and I appreciate that. I would say that the result of that entire process was very strong legislative support for the university, resulting in a budget cut, at least the first time around, of just $5 million, and much more recently, $25 million, which compares very favorably to $136 million. Again, very much appreciate the opportunity to work with the administration here as we continue to work with legislative leaders on our pursuit of a reasonable budget. I have a couple of specific points in terms of reduction and how a reduction generates positive outcomes. There is some really interesting and compelling data now available across, national data that looks at the impact on enrollment and on outcomes that came as a result of the big state budget cuts to higher education back in the 2008-2009 period. And as you might expect, those cuts had demonstrably negative effects on outcomes. Now, that doesn't say that that'll necessarily be the case here, but it clearly was in those other states. I too think that we have tried and will continue to pursue non-state funding for lots of our activities. First ever philanthropic campaign approved by this board and our board at our foundation recently. It's going to be nearly impossible, though, in the very near term, the kind of term that we're talking about here, to replace state funds with private or other sources. I really appreciate the governor's strong statements today and yours in support of the research that we do, oil and gas industry, mining, public safety, fishing, human and animal health, national security, on and on. Very, very important work that we do. And I'm really pleased to hear that you support a giant endowment to support research at the University of Alaska. So we'll take those up in our conversations with you. It's on the record. So I think what really helps again is the willingness of the administration to talk, and I think it also particularly is helpful when the data we all use is not selective, that it actually is put in context so that we can actually see the whole puzzle. And I think that helps everybody as we try to work together toward creating, as the governor indicated today, a very strong university for Alaska. So thanks again. I know you have a challenging role, and that's appreciated. Thank you, Mike.
Regent O'Neill.
Hi, Mike. A quick question on the formula that you used, and maybe you said this and I didn't quite hear, but it's based on full-time student enrollment, is that correct?
So the full-time equivalent data comes from the university. And so those numbers are compiled by staff, and the formula that they use is based on credit hours.
Credit hours, okay.
And so they do a calculation of how much is a full-time credit hour student, and they take the total number of credit hours, divide by that number, whatever it is, 16 credit hours. I'm not sure what is full-time. And that produces the full-time equivalent number of students.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify. And then follow-up question, just so I understand the appropriation language that relates to both preserving full funding for the University of Alaska Southeast and the community campuses. To what extent does that language governs the appropriation?
Correct.
But not the university. I'm just trying to understand the boundaries around that from your perspective.
From my perspective, and you can consult with your own lawyers on this, but appropriations are legally enacted lines of expenditure. And so if you want to move money from the University of Alaska Anchorage across an appropriation line to the University of Alaska Southeast, you couldn't do that. And by the same token, extending a cut that has been enacted into law on the university campuses, extending that to the community campuses, I think crosses appropriation lines impermissibly.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Myron?
May I just clarify that, Regent O'Neill, to your question? You can move money, but it's subject to a statute that provides that there be this thing called an RSA, or Reimbursable Services Agreement, which is essentially a contract between the two appropriations, that one appropriation bills for services of the other. So that's the mechanism in which it can be done, but that needs to be approved by the Office of OMB.
Right.
That's the case. Thank you.
Thank you.
Regent Purdue.
Since I love talking appropriations, you mentioned that the two appropriations exist and that the governor diminished the UAA, UAF statewide appropriation, but the legislature did not. So I just wanted to clarify that you were kind of mentioning that this was legislatively designed. They did divide the two appropriations, but they didn't take 85 million or 134 million out of one appropriation. I just want to clarify the difference in standing between the governor and yourself and the legislature.
Through the chair, I'm not sure I understand the question. So there are two appropriation items that are enacted into law by the legislature. As President Johnson said, the university campus appropriation was reduced by the legislature by $5 million, and then the governor line item that exact appropriation by an additional $130 million.
That's correct.
The community campus appropriation, again, enacted into law by the legislature with the same number in it that was in it for FY19. Had we had the two appropriation structure in FY19, the governor did not line item that. And so that forms the basis of my concern about the pro rata approach that extends a $10 million cut into that appropriation when it wasn't reduced.
I just wanted to clarify that the legislature did not reduce UAA and UAF and statewide, even though they created two appropriations. I just wanted to clarify that.
Except for the $5 million, that's correct.
President Johnson, I think there is a concern about the shared services issue, but President Johnson.
Well, that's exactly right. We've been talking really about the legality and appropriation structure here. There is also a reality that we are an integrated system at this point to some extent. And we've done the calculation where of the $57 million appropriation for UAS and the community campuses, some $12 million really needs to go to pay for costs that are incurred by the two regional universities and the statewide administration. They can't operate on their own with that particular appropriation. So there's a practical concern there that I think needs to be considered as well.
Through the chair, President Johnson, I think your point is fair and a point that can be taken up in our ongoing discussions. And I would say further that, as part of the discussions you're having as a board, you're considering new structures for the university. So there's the one university structure, there's a three university structure. That probably begs the question of appropriation structure as well, which is, again, I think it's a fair topic for inquiry and discussion.
Okay. Well, I'd just like to make a couple comments. I think that the part of the issue that we're dealing with is that I think that the premise that we need to be cut by 135 million is something that some of us disagree with. The university and the community colleges are an economic engine for the state of Alaska. For every state dollar we put in there, it returns to the general economy about 3 times that. So somewhere in the vicinity of $1 billion in the economy results from that approximately $300 million appropriation. So that's one thing. But in addition to that, the university is a prime vehicle for people improving their lot in life as well, so that our citizenry can participate fully in the economy and in our state. Over 90% of workforce development is done by the university. The vast majority of college level degrees are conferred at the University of Alaska system, across the system. And on average, this is only on average, isn't true for every single person, obviously, but on average, college-educated people are more satisfied with their jobs and earn more in their lifetime. My next point was going to be about the concern about the proviso language, so I'm going to skip that, given that we've had a little discussion of that. But I'm also troubled by what I consider to be the reckless suggestion that we should zero out state support for research. It was, even if that were an achievable goal, which I don't believe it is, but even if it were, it's certainly not something that we can achieve in 1 or 2 or 5 years. We're not going to run bake sales to run the Sekuli Act or something like that. It's just not possible. When you look at the museum, for example, that's also zeroed out, that is an archive of priceless, irreplaceable materials that have been accumulated over probably 75 years in one way or another. To contemplate just closing the doors on that and not maintaining the collections and not allowing researchers from across our state and across the nation, indeed across the world, people who use that collection to advance our understanding of issues about fisheries and issues about climate change and issues about how the biota of our state is changing as a response to climate change. Those are really important issues that the long-term elements of research that are in place need to stay in place. And you can't just, if you just close it down right now, that just disappears as a value overnight. It's easy to destroy it. It took 75 years to create it. So we have to be very careful in our stewardship of that resource that we have here. I just want to say, I want to tell you a quick personal story, which you may or may not be aware of, but in the 80s, I was the first state seismologist, which is a position provided for in statute. In that capacity, I helped create the Alaska Earthquake Center and the Alaska Volcano Observatory. In 1989, Mount Redoubt became very active, and the observatory put state and federal agencies on notice that it was active, and the observatory went on 24/7 alert status, watch status. One Sunday afternoon, the energy levels of the tremors coming from that volcano started increasing dramatically, and Tom Miller at the U.S. Geological Survey here and myself in Fairbanks decided that it was time to evacuate the folks that were at the Cook Inlet Pipeline Company at Drift River. They evacuated that day and the early next morning, and that afternoon the volcano blew up, and there was a flow of mud and ash that came down that Drift River that was equivalent to the volume of the Mississippi River. And it's, I think, a darn good thing that we got those people out of there. So, and I don't say this to look at myself. I say it because that's an experience I've had. This type of warning isn't possible without a long-term dedicated support for facilities and research that goes on so we can understand the significance of that type of activity and to have the facilities in place to provide the warning. So I think that we can, at the university here, we've been talking about, and we're going to hear more this afternoon about the efficiencies that we can address. Indeed, I put together a task force, a state task force, to look at ways that we could transition the university. But with all due respect, trying to do that transition in the course of 1 year, with anything on the order of $100 million cut in a single year. The analogy was used this morning. It's a house on fire. We don't have time to plan anything. We just got to get stuff out of the fire. And so I think what I would like to do is follow up what the legislature suggested in their legislative intent to us, which was to have us take 6 months or so, develop a multi-year plan, come back to you in December with a multi-year plan for how we get to whatever the right size of the university is. And I think that would be an approach where we would seriously look at those costs. Right? If you look at the proposal that President Johnson's going to outline in the next section of the meeting here, you'll see that it focuses very much on what you talked about. It focuses on reducing administration as much as possible and freeing up support for student services by hands as much as possible. So I think that in that general sense, we're on the same sheet of music, but the speed with which you think that we can move in that regard, I think, is vastly overstated. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Davies. First, I'd just like to say I acknowledge and respect your perspective. Unfortunately, in the state of Alaska, we've come to the point, and your consultant, Mr. Fisher, in 2011 said, we've come to this point and it was going to be a really, really tough road for several years. We're there today. And it's incumbent on all recipients of state funds, not just the university, to look at new ways of doing business, cost-effective ways of doing business, new ways of paying for the services. And I am the first to acknowledge valuable services that you have referenced just now to the state of Alaska. I believe in the university context, there is the opportunity, and I'm delighted to hear the discussions that are going on across the university and within this board on trying to look at those administrative overhead cost drivers. That's terrific news. I do believe there's opportunity to look for additional funds elsewhere, and I base that belief on the experience of universities that have gone through this in other states. So I welcome the opportunity for further discussion. If there's one ask, Mr. Chair, as we continue these discussions with staff, I do think it would be helpful to have a representative from the regents attend those discussions from time to time. I don't have to be there all the time. And I think it would also be helpful to